Good evening, everybody. My name is Jason Canincari, and I'm the principal at Gulf Road Junior Public School. I know we have a number of our families here, so a warm welcome to all of you. We always like to begin our events with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. As settlers and treaty members on Turtle Island and Tkaronto, we acknowledge our responsibilities to know the treaties and the responsibilities they entail. Treaties are a foundational part of our current Canadian society, as every road, building, or business that exists today in a treaty area was made possible because of a treaty. We are all treaty people. And now I would like to turn it over to my wonderful co-host for this evening, Miss Rosemary Sadler. And I have to say, I am so excited to be on a panel with her because not only is she an amazing speaker and such a wealth of knowledge, but as an educator, I've been using her book in my classroom for many years. The kids' book of Black Canadian history. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here on the digital stage with her. Rosemary.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to add, if you don't mind, Jason, to what you said, because we're talking about race and racism tonight. And often we do our land acknowledgements, and I think that there's another acknowledgement that we need to add to that. I'd like to also acknowledge that this land was settled and supported very early by people of African descent, the first named being translator Matthew da Costa by 1604, and of the ongoing and seminal contribution made by him and those who preceded and followed in Canada's development. I acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will and made to work on these lands. We must acknowledge that African Canadians were an integral part of shaping Canadian history too, and history would not be the same without the Black experience. Now, I'm delighted to share this panel with you, Jason. Of course, you were principal of a school that has such an important name, the Nelson Mandela School, where I first recall meeting you. And I think that before I move on to introduce our panelists, I will just add a little bit more to your introduction. As you already know, he is a principal, Jason Canincari. His pronouns are he and him, is a principal with Toronto District School Board. He worked in Regent Park, the Nelson Mandela School I mentioned, over the past 10 years and is now working in Scarborough. He is passionate about working in underserved communities and how we can work to ensure schools are sites of liberation and possibility for all students. And just before I tell you about the panelists, let me add to my own introduction. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an author, consultant, and I was the unpaid past president for 22 years of the Ontario Black History Society. And under my leadership, building on the efforts and work of the ancestors and elders, I was able to achieve numerous public commemorations relating to African Canadian history and culture, including February is Black History Month, and most recently, August 1st as Emancipation Day, to affirm and honor our long-term and continuing contribution to Canada. Now, our special guests tonight, and we're really delighted to have them, include two people who have done a lot of work in terms of mental health or other elements of health and psychology. Simone Donaldson is the founder and clinical social worker and principal consultant at Agape Lens Consulting and Therapy. She has devoted almost 15 years to racialized communities and mental health. Simone provides individual psychotherapy for Black youth and adults and consults with organizations to bridge the gap between equity and wellness concerns, with a specialization in anti-Black racism. Simone's purpose is to support all her clients to see sustainable change while guiding them patiently and safely towards authenticity so they may heal, thrive, and live out their purpose. And our other panelist this evening is Dr. Ghada Almahar. She's an MD, consulting hypnotist, life and health coach, certified in applied positive psychology. She's a neuro-linguistic programming and, I'm going to get this wrong, Ayurveda lifestyle specialists. She's a founder of Heaven Smile Center in Toronto, a wellness center focusing on integrative health, mind-body connection, and empowering the community to have optimum physical and mental health. She offered several workshops in the field of wellness and life balance. Now that you know who we are, we're going to have our session follow a pretty straightforward process. What will happen is that when I find the questions, and here they are, what will happen is that we will have, and those are not the questions, and those are not the questions. Give me a moment, but we will alternate. Jason will ask a question. We will give the panelists an opportunity to answer, and then I will ask a question. And that's how we will proceed through the evening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please put them in the chat and we will definitely get to them. But we also intend to have some time at the end for question and answer. So Jason, I will have you give your first question if you don't mind.
Thank you. So the first question, language is important. For many years now, the language around how we in education describe youth, using words like violent and aggressive, is problematic, especially in the context of race and who these labels are typically applied to. What are your thoughts around this? And I pose this to our panel.
So I could start off here. Thank you all again for having me here. I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation with everyone. I think it's such a important conversation, and sometimes the space isn't being held to do so. And so I just want to first acknowledge ComFest, the TDSB, for organizing such an important discussion. So to your first question, Jason, around language, it's words are power. Language is power. And I think sometimes we don't realize that both the language and the words that we use, it actually connects to the way we feel and understand things. And as a result of that, it means that our attitudes and behaviors also are dictated by the way we understand things, the way we see things, and the words that we use. When I think about this question, I automatically went to, okay, how about we talk about the angry Black woman? And I know we're talking about youth today, but I think it's really important that we understand that they are an extension of their families. And so I think about the mother who's coming to the school, a Black woman, for instance, and frustrated with the way she's being treated at school, or her children are being treated at school. And because she is a Black woman, and oftentimes there's this label of being angry, her needs would not be met, but instead it might be addressed with a lot of tension, a lot of defensiveness, and no space for her to explain herself. Then when we look at our youth specifically, I think about the term called adultification. And so this word really describes the way in which a lot of our youth are being treated as adults, which means, and specifically our Black youth, when we talk about adultification, they often are seen as not needing as much nurturance, not as much warmth and comfort as many of their other counterparts. They're not needing, the love and attention that often other youth would be given if they were in a problematic situation. But instead, unfortunately, they're labeled with these words such as aggressive and violent. And we see the manifestation of this in the overrepresentation in the suspension and expulsion rates within our school boards. We see how it manifests. And so again, language is very important because it really does determine how we see and behave towards our youth. And it could be very problematic for them in the long run and their families.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would like to start with thanking the Confess for organizing this important topic about racism and mental health and the youth. I'm so excited to be with you all today. And regarding to answering the question related to the language, we know in positive psychology that our brain is wired toward negativity bias. So, and that negativity is connected with the way we behave, our emotions, and our actions as well. So, talking about the youth in terms of violence or being disrespectful or like out of control would ultimately affect their behavior and their emotions, whether within like their community, within their family, and with their peers as well, whether they are from the same race or like from different ethnicity group. So it's probably we need to call for change in the labeling toward promoting character strength and labeling them and with like positive labeling, like being friendly, compassionate, resourceful, creative. So probably that will help in lowering also the impact of racism and how they deal with each others within like community of diversity.
Well, thank you very much for those very insightful responses. Your next question. From my own lived experience as a student and as a parent, I am aware of how damaging a lack of racial or diverse representation can be on the mental health of students and on the school climate in general. Some racialized students may underperform, and some may act out as a result. So what steps would you suggest for parents and for educators who are seeking ways to address this?
I can start with this. There have been studies shown that diversity and inclusion of so many people from different ethnicity group, even at the level of educators, can help student success in terms of outcome of their education. So having different background and at the educator level probably will help deal with different type of group of people or group of students. They might have ability to deal more with minority people. So I would say in terms of inclusion, probably even at administrative level, having more teachers from more diverse background. And in terms of students and families, probably we need to involve them more and include them more, specifically when they are belonging to a minority group. Like integrate them in different student activity, family related activities, and so on. That will definitely and ultimately improve the student success and impact their emotions and behaviors.
Absolutely. So just to add to my colleagues' responses, I want to start off by saying representation matters. It really, really does. I think when people see others that look like them, automatically there's actually this sense of safety and there's this sense of belongingness. And unfortunately, the one thing, if there's nothing else that racism has done to our racialized youth, it has ensured that we don't feel as though we belong, right? It makes them feel as though they don't belong. There's something something wrong with them, they are less than. And so I think when we do have a diverse population, whether it be the kids, the educators, etc., it really allows them to see themselves differently. It allows them to see themselves as someone who, belongs in the environment that they're in, that they're not less than, but they're, on equal plane, or at least their values are being honored. Their culture, their ethnicity is being valued and celebrated. And so I just want to make sure folks know representation truly matters. It's not just about having the bodies there, but it truly provides us mentally, emotionally with a sense of belonging. It also helps our self-esteem, right? So when we talk about youth and the struggles that they sometimes have in our schools, we have to recognize that when we're not being seen in our books that we're learning from, when we're being taught the wrong history, what we are telling folks is that, this is where you belong and that's it, right? There's a superiority in one race, and the rest of you guys are just, you're just here to possibly support us. And I think it's really important that we recognize this representation not only happen through the way in which we hire, but also the material that we're using, the posters that we see around the schools. It's extremely important that we have these as ways to support our racialized youth to feel welcomed and supported. One other thing my colleague touched on was, she started to allude to the fact that racism really is systemic, right? So this isn't just an individual issue. And so those that are in power really need to take the reins on ensuring that the environment that is created there through hiring, through the curriculum that they're being taught, that the teachers are teaching, that those really reflect equitable kind of teaching and understanding versus the one, lane kind of education that we've been getting for years upon end. Similar to my colleague, for sure, with the parents, I think it's so important to get your kids involved in activities that really help them to embrace their ethnicity, that really allow them to honor their culture. And of course, in the schools, if there's groups that can be created as well to reflect that, for people to have that special, safe and sacred space, as I like to call it, I think that would be really, really helpful. And once again, back to my conversation around, ensuring that we have diverse books that are in our classrooms, for instance, to educate our children so they see themselves and they realize that they are a part of this society and a very important and valuable part of this society. So those are some of the things that I think are important. Of course, at home, I think it's important that we continue to center, Blackness, center the things that are specific to your race and your culture, and not allow that, white supremacy or white privilege to be kind of the standard that we are holding our households to as well, because we're all impacted in different ways, but really recognizing that there's so much value that we all bring to the table. Truly there is.
Thank you so much for that. Those were great answers. I appreciate it. Jason, you have another question.
I do. And just before I get into that question, Simone, to both of you, actually, I really thank you because you raise an interesting point, that notion how important the importance of representation. As you said, representation matters. And you really caused me to pause and reflect. In schools, we're very lucky. We have the teachers of tomorrow in front of us, right? And so what can we do more intentionally as a school district to promote mentoring for the future teachers of tomorrow, so that diversity that we want in classrooms, we encourage the youth when they're in front of us, the diverse group of kids that I have at Gulf Road as an example, or at Mandela previously, to get into teaching, and that we create some kind of track for them to be able to get hired into classrooms. So I think that's a really concrete action that I'd like to take forward to my colleagues and talk about how can we be more intentional with mentoring to get the diversity we seek. So thank you.
Of course.
So the question that I have for you is, in my work in schools, I see a real intersection between race, mental health, and school outcomes. From your vantage, what are the things we should be considering when thinking about race, mental health, and schooling?
Would you like me to start?
Go
So
for it.
I could start. I thought I didn't want to be talking again, but I'll definitely go ahead. So yeah, mental health and race, the intersection is very, very real, very much connected. So again, in my practice, I do primarily focus on the Black community, but of course, I've worked with the racialized community for many, many years. And one thing that I often have to unpack and support people around is what we call racial microaggressions. So racial microaggressions essentially is like intentional and intentional ways in which we communicate to racialized folks, negative attitudes toward them. They don't belong here, indignities, things that really make them feel as though they are truly less than. This happens in subtle ways more often than not, and this is why they call it micro, although of course the impact is far from micro. It's quite huge at impact. And so we also talk about, and so this could lead to what we call racial trauma as well. And what makes racial trauma very different than, for instance, post-traumatic stress disorder is that this is an everyday occurrence that folks are having to address and deal with. And you could only imagine if you're constantly being told you don't belong, you're not good enough, something is wrong with you and your culture. You only are able to move this far in this world. You know what I mean? You're not sophisticated enough. Even something as small as your hair is not beautiful enough and it needs to be straightened, to if you wear that traditional clothing, you're not all of a sudden professional. We have to really think about these things and what are the messages that it's telling our racialized youth and their families. And what's interesting, it really does start to happen from a very young age because, again, all of what's around us. So once again, I go back to my example of like, what are the books that we're using that are telling our children that they actually don't matter in these educational sessions, that their opinions, their views, their ways of being aren't as important or valued. So what this can do is cause a huge, so we talk about internalized racism as well. And so this is the idea that once again, you as a racialized person, you are inferior, something is wrong with you. And it really just strips away that ethnic identity, that racialized identity. And for many of our students and or adults, when unresolved especially, can lead to things like low self-esteem. So the constant questioning of oneself, this idea that I could only do so many things, or maybe we even get socialized into certain things like basketball, right? Like we see our young Black boys often being streamed into sports versus academics. So these are the things that could happen. And so sometimes what will happen is our youth might work 10 times harder, which is not fair because that means more stress, right, on them in order to succeed, or they'll lose motivation because they feel like, okay, well, this is what I've been told is my place in this world, in this earth. And so this is as far as I can go, right? And so it really plays on our psyche, our mental health, how we see ourselves, and ultimately what we can accomplish both in school and for our careers long term. So I think when we talk about the intersection of race and mental health, it's so important to continuously have these conversations because truly it is an everyday experience, whether it's because of the anxiety a parent has to, think about when their child is walking to school and the possibility of being pulled over from the police, or them being in the classroom and not feeling as though they're smart enough to put up their hands, and or whether their comments are valuable. It's such a integral part, unfortunately, in addressing racism that we have to keep talking about.
Absolutely. I echo everything you have said, Simone. Mental health and racism are very interlinked. Racism can cause or like aggravate what's like if there is any mental health issues before, it can affect both the mental health and physical health. So people can suffer from stress and stress related disorder, and then depression. Maybe they tend to have substance abuse, and then probably suicide. And I have seen it even like as a medical professional. And then it affects overall their academic also performance. So they tend to have probably lower score because they don't feel belong to the school, or they can't participate participate enough. They can have also dropping out of school, not finishing high school, not going to college, affecting their career. And in my practice as well, what I seen, as Simon mentioned, lower self-esteem, lower self-confidence, and their ability to have choices in their life. So it's not only at that particular time of their life. The impact might be lifelong. So that's what we need to think about it when we think about racism and mental health.
Well, thank you so much for those responses. They're, you're covering everything. But I think that it's important for us to continue to ask you some of these questions that we have, even though some of the replies tend to be reinforcing each other. And I see that we are getting some comments, so I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. And please don't hesitate to put your questions or comments into the chat box. The next question. Students do spend a lot of time interacting with their teachers. And I mean, this is, let's talk COVID and pre-COVID. They're with them or with some educator for perhaps 6 hours a day, give or take. Having worked in many schools, I have encountered teachers who are both challenging in their handling and perspectives of non-white students, as well as those who are allies in terms of anti-racism. What advice would you provide a student, a parent, or a fellow teacher in dealing with educators, the supportive ones and the not so supportive ones?
I would start with this. I think the most important thing is having a safety culture where everyone can share their thoughts and red flag anything wrong within this culture, and promoting a culture of inclusion. Having sets of rules and expectation from everyone. So this is the school, this is the rules. No racism is allowed by any means, as well as allowing students and their families to speak up if they notice any unwanted behavior, and also promoting and supporting any anti-racism behavior within the school. Those are the things that come into my mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yes. So similar to my colleague, I do, once again, I think it's so important that we continue to remember that racism is truly systemic. It's not an individual issue per se, right? It starts really from the top down. And so I say that purposely because I do think as much as it would be great for our students to have skills and tips, as much as it'd be great for our parents and our educators to have tips and skills and different ways in approaching these things, we do truly need to create a culture of safety. As my colleague mentioned, we do need to put things in place that actually create that safety so people feel they can actually say something, right? Because if there's nothing else, once again, that racism has done, it's silenced folks. It's made them feel as though what they're saying isn't worthy. Oftentimes, people are feeling as though if they say something, then they're going to be penalized for it, or they're going to be labeled with those words that we talked about earlier, the angry Black mother, the aggressive young boy. Like all these different things are going to be put into account. So I do think first and foremost, it needs to start from the powers that be. So whether it is the sorry, I don't remember the name of those who are outside of the schools, but the superintendents, it needs to start with them. It needs to start with the principals. It needs to start with all the admin staff, all those who are truly in power positions that can create those spaces. So that might mean having a specific equity team that is on board there so that there's no biases from internally, right? And that also helps with accountability. However, I will say, of course, there's things that we would love for our students to do when they feel safe and comfortable to do so, which is to speak to someone who they feel comfortable with. And that goes back again, to be quite honest, to spaces where they feel safe to do so. And not just an administrative per se, but someone that truly is skilled and learned in equity issues or anti-Black racism specific issues, as an example. For the parents, we also want them to be able to support their youth, and if they're not feeling heard or seen or valued, I would highly recommend that they, go to agencies such as community health centers who have social workers there, and other agencies externally, to get an advocate, a social worker, someone who could really support them to move through that process. Because to be quite honest, it's quite tiring, and sometimes it's also re-traumatizing to go through the process of trying to get the support. And then for educators who are actually a little more helpful, what I would say is continue to speak up, because true allyship isn't just about stating that you recognize that there's something wrong, but it really is an action-oriented kind of identity or role that you take on. And so I think that is what needs to happen. And I think there's very, there's very particular ways to go about that. But I do think speaking up and being action-oriented is kind of what has to happen in order for things to change, and for folks to change their behavior when they're actually not treating youth and or their families very well.
Well, thank you. Those were excellent responses, and it's certainly generating some comments in the chat, which we will get to. But we've got a couple more questions before we get to that. So Jason, could you go ahead and give your last question?
Yes, and just before that, I'd like to just touch upon, I think, an important point that was raised. When we do these kinds of sessions tonight and we talk about empowering parents, that's exactly what we're doing, because through building our own understanding and awareness and educating ourselves on what's happening in the education system in terms of racism and its impact on mental health, that way you can have a better conversation and hold people accountable. I welcome when parents come and they cite their concerns to me. It shows to me that you're a concerned stakeholder. Nobody's going to care more about your child than you, right? And it's us working together in partnership, family and school, that will get those positive outcomes that we seek. But please, I say to parents that are listening, if you are seeing the school engaged in actions that you feel are not supportive, that you feel are perpetuating racist stereotypes, that are not challenging things that need to be challenged in society, then have conversations with your child's teacher. If you're not feeling you're getting traction there, talk to the principal. If you're a parent at my school, come and talk to me. We got to work together as partners, and it's really important to be comfortable to hold people accountable.
Sorry, can I interrupt? One thing you just said there, I think that sometimes as parents, before you ask your question, but something you said just sparked something. I think that sometimes as parents, we want our kids to tell us about how their day went in terms of the academics, but we aren't maybe probing a little bit more to find out about other things that might be going on for them. Because we might have our own level of discomfort and whatnot. And I think that we need to be able to do both. We need to be able to notice that there's something not right going on at our child's school, but we also have to empower our child to be able to share what they are seeing and what's a cause of concern for them. Whether it's a racist stereotype in a book or something that happened in the schoolyard, so that we have that information, those examples to bring forward.
Yes, yeah. And another thing, every school has what's called a school improvement plan. And an integral part of that plan is the work that the school is doing around equity, promoting a level, fair playing field so that all students can be successful. And as a parent, I encourage you, ask the staff at the school, ask your child. Your child should be able to articulate to you, what is the school's improvement plan in equity? There should be conversations about it throughout the school, in the classroom. There should be no confusion on what that goal is and how the school is working to achieve that goal. So right now, I know in many schools, mine included, we have a real focus on confronting anti-Black racism. Hence my participation in this event, encouraging parents to come out. So make sure that you understand what your school's equity goal is and what your school is doing to achieve that goal. That is important.
Yeah, that's really, really important. I'm so glad that you both brought those points together, right? Because I do think, of course, if we could work with the school as much as possible, we want to do that, understand the different things that are in place, because truly it's about building the community and not just individuals. And if one family or one individual is being impacted by this, then likely a few or a lot, majority are, right? And I love the point that Rosemary made around parents being intentional, because you're right. Until we ask those specific questions,
May not get the information.
sometimes we don't get those specific answers. And I think to start having those conversations at home, to both empower and, open up that conversation so they know they're not alone and that what they're experiencing is very real is actually quite important. Because in Canada, it's very subtle. It's very much entrenched in our systems. And so we often can't see it even as adults when it's happening, right? So I do encourage, just like Rosemary stated, having those conversations regularly needs to be a part of that process to healing. Absolutely.
Good points. One more thing to add is related to Rosemary point. I always teach families to ask their kids, tell me at the end of the day, what's 3 good things and 3 not good things happen at school. That will open a whole total different of discussion, and you can tap on into different things more than the academic part.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jason, we should go to your question.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time and I'm thinking parts of my question kind of got addressed through the conversation we were just having. And I'm thinking, let's go to the final question, Rosemary. So we also have time to get a little bit more feedback from our audience and answer any audience questions.
And I agree with you. The questions have been very helpful in bringing out a lot of information that I think should be valuable. I hope it's valuable to those of you out there watching. But the final question, the final set question, we're looking forward to your questions, is what steps would you encourage or consider or offer in supporting mental health and building resilience in racialized students in particular?
So I think I mentioned some of this earlier because I'm a strong believer in, ensuring that our youth are engaged in activities outside of the school and inside the school, of course, that really celebrate their culture, their ethnicity. I think it's so important that we remember that we all have so much to offer, and the diversity of our ethnic backgrounds or of our culture truly is what makes us a rich community, a rich society, right? And so if we're able to explore those a little bit more, it really draws us closer to our identities, our ethnic identities, versus having to feel as though we have to conform and assimilate to a standard that truly is much more oppressive than it is helpful. So I think that is extremely important. Mentorship, Jason, I know you mentioned this earlier. For me, I'm always of the idea of it takes a village mentality. So it takes a village to raise a child. But not only does it take a village to raise a child, it takes a healthy village to raise a healthy child. And so getting the appropriate mentors to support our children and feeling as though there is some greatness to them, a purpose, and really helping them to, just nurture their gifts, their talents, and help them to realize that they can be so much more than sometimes these stereotypes tell us, is really an important part of, I think, the growth and that resilience that we talk about. And I can't be on here as a therapist and not talk about the importance of therapy being also a safe space for folks to be able to discuss some of their challenges, because we're all being impacted in a variety of ways. And some of them really do require professional guidance and conversation to unpack the impact it's had on us. And so I definitely encourage folks to also think about therapy and not look at it like it's a, space just for folks who have these extreme disorders that feel like they can't be managed or anything like that. It really is just a safe space for you to be able to explore mental health challenges and racial trauma, racial microaggressions, anxiety, low self-esteem. These things are, topics that can be addressed in these spaces. So those are a few of the ones that I will give to those.
And can I, just in support of that idea, we can have great friends and we can have
Absolutely.
great family, but family and friends are not always equipped or able or have time to be able to provide you with the kind of assistance that might be most helpful to you.
Absolutely.
So I think that's just one other reason for getting the kind of support that might be useful.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. And I echo what Simone mentioned. And to add to it, teaching kids how to express their emotions and their feelings, and teaching them also strategies to deal with the stress and express themselves. As Simone mentioned, therapies are available as well. So whomever needs just even to discuss and like express themselves, there are many ways to have therapists in different sectors to help them and guide them. So that's the things that come to me.
I'm just looking at the chat, and I'm going to put this out to you panelists. We've got a few minutes here. One of the first questions is about systemic racism, and maybe we should just briefly define what that is before we move on, so that we can talk. I mean, we've been talking like everybody knows what these terms mean, but we've been talking about systemic racism and intersectionality, and maybe we should just take a moment, step back, and define those.
Absolutely. So systemic racism really is looking at how racism is displayed within our world, right? And so it's recognizing that, so when we talk about racism in general, really what we're talking about is white supremacy. The idea that there's a certain group of people who have more power and are superior to others, right? And so with this kind of idea also means that somehow their way of thinking and being and behaving, the way they look, all of that is also much more superior and it's much more acceptable in our world. And this has become the standard, right? So the standard of whiteness is often what I talk about. And so when these behaviors and attitudes become the norm, it impacts our government, so our policies, the things that we, how our institutions are run. So whether it's the school or hospitals, so all of these different systems that our children, our families are a part of. And it also, of course, impacts our day-to-day interactions. So when we talk about systemic racism, it just means that simply when we're talking about racism, recognizing that this stems from something so much bigger than just the individual, and it really has impacted the way our society operates, right? From the top down. And so it impacts every single institution. So systemic, our governments, our policies out there, our institutions, so our schools, our hospitals, as well as our individual interactions with each other, the attitudes, the behaviors, etc. So that's what systemic racism is. Hopefully that was a good definition.
No, I think that's a great response, and I think it's really important for everybody to recognize, you know, on an individual level. So you're working with people in the education system, lots of really nice people that have good intentions. But the issue is people working within systems and structures that are needing to be overhauled, right? And so people with great intentions, really wanting to do right by children, but operating within a system that promotes outcomes that are unequal. That's really what we're here tonight to try and address that. And we can only start to get those fair outcomes by parents advocating, asking the questions that need to be asked of their children and the staff at the school, so that people really start to work at changing some of the structures. So for instance, we look at the placement of students in our specialized programs in the Toronto District School Board. I'll use my own school board as an example right now. It is a really unfair representation that we see in those programs. And so it's incumbent on us as a school board to start to rethink the way that we admit students into these specialized programs, so that those programs reflect the great diversity of the school board, because right now they don't. You do not see the great diversity of children that we would have in a school like mine at Gulf Road in these specialized programs. And we know that these specialized programs offer a direct pathway to university and to the most sought after programs in post-secondary. They need to be available for all our children.
You know, just when you said that, people might think that this only happens to somebody else's children or people you don't know. I just, in something I was doing earlier today, mentioned something that I was reminded of. And as the only Black kid in my school, when I went to my guidance counselor at a particular moment in time for guidance, suggestions about what I should be doing going forward in terms of high school, let's guess what he suggested I should or should not do. He suggested that I should become a secretary, which was at the time absolutely nothing I had ever conceived of, nothing I wanted to do. And what was quite fascinating is that people who had exactly the same marks as I did or less in my class were being encouraged to go to university. So very early on, I had to learn to be selective in what advice I was going to follow.
Mhm.
And I think that sometimes we get advice and it might be absolutely appropriate. But I think it's also fair for us to get advice and to question that advice. And especially when it comes to placement in non-university bound programming, that is when you really need to question it. Because why is it that we find those programs, as Jason indicated, so overpopulated with Black, Indigenous, and people of color? There's a reason. And part of that reason is preconceived notions. And part of that reason is, there's many reasons, but part of it is preconceived notions. So you know what your child is capable of as a parent. You have some ideas from maybe other subjects or other grade years, and you can use that information to help inform how you choose to accept, because advice is not a verdict, it's advice, and you can keep it, follow it, or challenge it.
Agreed.
Part of the conversation that I've been having with some parents as of late too is that it's not any kind of snobbery that we have towards the university path or anything like that. But what we want for all our children is for all the pathways to be open so that they can make the choice. We do not want their future predetermined by someone that's carrying these kinds of negative bias in their heart and mind and limiting the choices for your child. That's really what it's all about, ensuring that every pathway is open, whether that be a pathway to being a tradesperson, wonderful, if that's what they want to do, but also if they want to become an author of a book that, the co-panelist uses all the time when they were in the classroom, that should be an opportunity for them as well, right? So we just want to keep the pathways open for all our children.
Yeah, we want them to all realize their potential, their purpose, their loves, what drives them, and sometimes our system really limits us, and it's crazy because I've had the same experience as Rosemary, right? And so we do need to question sometimes the advice we're given, but ultimately, yeah, I think what's great is when we are able to look at the system and say, okay, are we equally or equitably, right? Because equally and equitably, two different things, but are we truly creating the pathway to ensure that all of our children have the chance to reach their potential, to live out their potential?
Yeah, in that perspective, we need the support of the families as well to their kids so they can make the good choices for themselves as well.
I see in the chat that someone, I believe what you're saying is that I always teach at home, then they can behave at school. So I'm going to, what it means to me is that you make a point of reinforcing certain things at home so that when they go into school, they already come prepared. They know what to do and they know what to look for. Would that be correct in terms of what you've offered here? But I think that, taking the responsibility as a parent is very important. We can never assume, thank you. Okay, she's agreeing. We can never assume that school will do it all.
For sure.
School is not your aunt or your sister, your brother. School is something that your kids are part of for 6 hours or 5 hours or whatever. You have a role in helping to develop your child. Don't be afraid to provide your guidance too.
But I will say that school does have a role in creating the conditions for learning for your child and the optimal conditions. And a lot of that relates to what we've been discussing tonight. Educators working on their equity lens, realizing equity is not equal. We give to what people need to be successful. It's about ensuring, when we think about what are the posters in the classroom? What are the books that children are being asked to read? Do they see themselves reflected in those texts? Because I'll tell you, when all those pieces are in place, the quote unquote behavior, it goes way down because the children are interested and engaged in their learning. And the responsibility for that piece is on us as the educators in the school to create those ideal conditions for learning. Absolutely. Parent in school, family in school, working in partnership. Family is going to work on things at home and reinforce those behaviors that we want to see, the positive behaviors. But if we at the school don't create those conditions for those behaviors to flourish, then it's not going to happen either. So it's us working together.
And your tax dollars pay for that education. So that's very, very important. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, and I see that we are coming very close to our time here. So I think that before I thank the panel, I want to thank Sandy and ComFest. This has been, I think, a really amazing way to to address social justice issues in the community. They start with our kids, and they encompass our school, formal education. They encompass informal education, such as through film. And I encourage you all to support ComFest Film Festival and all of their activities, because they're trying to address your needs. So thank you so much, Sandy DeFreitas, for what you have done with ComFest. And thank you very, very much. There's one more question. Do you feel like it is still the same situation now as it was at the time when you graduated? What's the right answer? You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say, and please, this may be politically incorrect, but I'm going to say it's the same. And the reason that I'm going to say it's the same is because things improve, but every time they improve a little bit, then they change in another way to make them a bit of a challenge. And I think the other part of why I would say it's the same is because the Black, Indigenous, and people of color population has dramatically increased in the past 20 years. Of course, I graduated just yesterday. So things have clearly stayed the same. And so I think all that to say that as much as things do improve, then they can become problematic in some other areas. So that's why we have to constantly, not every single day, every minute, but be mindful, watch what's going on, and be involved in your own and in your child's education, and hold the school that your tax dollars support accountable for being the safe places that they are often trying to be.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to the panel. Jason, you're a great moderator. Simone, Doctor, amazing responses. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all the parents for joining us tonight.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
believe, if I'm not mistaken, this has been recorded, and hopefully at some future time, people will be able to see it again.
Amazing. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Have a wonderful evening.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Should we stay on?
Bye.
I don't know.
Bye.
Shall we stay on for a minute and see if we're okay?
That'd be great.
Sure.
I think we have wonderful dialogue. Thank you. Very informative. Thank you. Wonderful day. Safe one. Yes. Okay. So it looks like everybody was happy. Attendees, we'd like to encourage you to go and see one of the films now. Tomorrow, when you can go and see St. Lawrence, which is a film created by ComFest by Sandy DeFreitas. So
amazing.
And we're going to do the draw later on tonight, and we will email the lucky winners of those 5 gift cards tomorrow.
5? I should have put my name in.
I know. Use an alias.
Okay. I think Yeah. Basically, we're saying hi.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, you
Yeah.
can now. For some reason, I was cut out, but I was listening to everything. It was wonderful. It
Good.
was really amazing.
Good.
I guess we're just
I
waiting
think
for
that-
folks to leave.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any questions in the any of our
Well,
guests?
I've been trying to follow the chat. I don't think there were more questions.
Yeah, I don't think
People were
there's-
mostly agreeing or
Yeah.
appreciative. So that's good.
Well, that's great. Well, did we want to sign off? Is there a way to sign off that you want, or do you just want to say goodbye?
Is the point here that you're hoping that we can all talk to each other for a few minutes and do a little bit
Yes,
of
sure. We can stay on as long as you want.
maybe what we're going to have to do is I wonder, can we let's see.
Is the audience still here? That looks so.
Can I delete audiences? Can I uninvite them?
Could we, what if we ended this and then we come back onto the link? Like just for us to do a debrief. Would that work, Sandy?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we try that? So if everyone exits out and then we come back on, and it should just be us to do our little debrief.
Okay, that's great.
Okay.
Thank
See
you.
you all soon.
Everyone, thank you
Bye,
so much.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Bye.
Here we are. It looks like people are just hanging out.
Well, it might be just it just looks that way, but I don't think anyone's in the audience. Let me just ask. Is Jason?
It says on the side here, I think it says shows 10 participants or
10.
viewers.
That's what I said to you.
Well, maybe they have something to ask.
Okay.
Well, we won't say anything incriminating.
Yeah, I think that went really well. So again, thank you, Sandy, for bringing us together.
Oh, it was a great discussion. It's one of the best I've heard.
Good.
Oh,
Good.
thank you, Sandy.
Thank
It is.
you.
It's really, no one's holding back anything, and it's really constructive, I feel. And that was the intention.
Good. So in terms of being able to share